In the first week of August 2026, the President of the United States stood before reporters and used a word no one expects to hear in modern diplomacy. He said Iran had a last chance before what he called decapitation. Within hours, a spokesperson in Tehran stood at a podium of his own and said something just as startling. He said there were no negotiations with America at all. Not now, not planned, not even discussed. Two governments, describing the same moment in history, could not agree on whether they were even talking to each other. That confusion is not a footnote to this story. It is the story, because somewhere between a claimed deal on a shipping lane and a flat denial that any deal exists, the fate of one of the most volatile regions on Earth is being decided, and almost nobody outside a small circle of officials actually knows which version is true. To understand how two nations arrived at a moment where their leaders cannot even agree on basic facts, it helps to go back nearly half a century to 1979, when the Iranian Revolution toppled the American-backed Shah and radicalized a generation of Iranian leadership around distrust of Washington. The hostage crisis that followed, when Iranian students held American diplomats for 444 days, set a tone of mutual suspicion that has never fully faded. For decades afterward, the two countries maintained no formal diplomatic relations, communicating instead through intermediaries, sanctions, and periodically through Iran's expanding nuclear program, which became the central flashpoint of the 21st century relationship. In 2015, that tension briefly eased. The United States, alongside France, Britain, Germany, China, and Russia, signed the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action with Iran, a deal that capped uranium enrichment and opened Iranian nuclear sites to international inspectors in exchange for relief from crippling sanctions. It was, for a moment, considered one of the most significant non-proliferation agreements in modern diplomatic history. Then, in 2018, during his first term, President Trump withdrew the United States from that agreement entirely, arguing it was too weak and too temporary, and reimposed sanctions that had just been lifted. Iran's enrichment activity, largely paused under the deal, began climbing again. By the mid-2020s, that climb had become impossible for Western intelligence agencies to ignore. Israeli strikes in 2024 degraded parts of Iran's air defense and missile infrastructure. Then, in June 2025, came what is now referred to as the 12-Day War, a short but intense campaign in which Israel struck Iranian military and nuclear facilities directly, followed by a negotiated ceasefire. It should have been a turning point toward diplomacy. Instead, it became a preview. Just months later, in October 2025, Iran's Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei publicly rejected an American offer to resume nuclear talks, dismissing Washington's claim that the strikes that summer had destroyed Iran's nuclear capabilities. That single rejection is worth pausing on because it reveals something that would define the following year. Even after direct military strikes, Iran's leadership was not going to simply concede on nuclear enrichment, and the United States was not going to simply accept Iran's insistence that its program was purely civilian. Earlier that same year, in March and April, Trump had personally written to Khamenei proposing direct negotiations, warning that military action was on the table if diplomacy failed. Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian responded by rejecting the idea of direct talks, but leaving a door open for indirect ones, mediated through Oman, a channel that has quietly kept communication alive between Washington and Tehran for years. Iran's foreign minister, Abbas Araghchi, echoed that same position days later, framing Iran as prepared for diplomacy, but equally prepared to defend its sovereignty by force if necessary. That pattern, an American offer, an Iranian hedge, a partial rejection, and a slow drift back toward confrontation, repeated itself through most of 2025 and into early 2026. It is worth understanding why Iran kept hedging, rather than simply agreeing or simply refusing outright. Iranian officials have consistently framed enrichment not just as a technical program, but as a matter of sovereignty. A right, they argue, was affirmed under the original non-proliferation framework they signed decades ago, and something they were not willing to be seen abandoning under open threat. At the same time, Iran's economy had been strangled by years of sanctions, its currency had collapsed in value, and its regional proxy network, badly weakened by Israeli operations against Hezbollah and Hamas since 2023, no longer offered the same deterrent leverage it once did. That left Iranian leadership negotiating from a position that was simultaneously defiant and precarious, unwilling to fully capitulate, but increasingly unable to project the kind of strength that had once made outright confrontation with Washington and Israel unthinkable. Indirect negotiations, mediated by Oman, resumed in February 2026. And for a moment, there were signs of real movement. Omani officials reportedly described significant progress, with Iran said to be willing to make concessions on enrichment levels. But Trump, according to multiple reports, said he was not thrilled with how the talks were going, and within weeks, that faint diplomatic momentum collapsed entirely. What happened next moved faster than almost anyone expected. On February 28, 2026, in a coordinated operation that Israeli and American officials had reportedly been planning for months, the United States and Israel launched close to 900 strikes against Iranian targets in roughly 12 hours. The stated goals, according to American officials, included dismantling Iran's ballistic missile capability, crippling its navy, permanently preventing it from acquiring a nuclear weapon, and severing its support for regional proxy forces. Some officials went further, describing an aim of encouraging Iranians themselves to overthrow their government. The first wave of strikes killed Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, along with dozens of other senior officials, a moment with almost no precedent in the modern history of state-on-state conflict, since it marked the killing of a sitting head of state of a major regional power by direct military action. Iran's government did not collapse. Instead, succession moved quickly, with Khamenei's son emerging as his replacement, and Iran's military and political structure, battered but intact, began organizing retaliation almost immediately. That first day of strikes also killed people far removed from any military target. A missile struck a girls' school adjacent to a naval base near Bandar Abbas, killing around 170 people, a devastating reminder that, in modern warfare, the line between military infrastructure and civilian life is rarely as clean as strategic briefings suggest. What followed raised a question that, months later, still has no fully agreed answer. How much damage had actually been done to Iran's nuclear program? A preliminary assessment from the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency, circulated at low confidence and later leaked to the press, concluded that Iran had moved much of its enriched uranium stockpile before the strikes occurred, and that the underground facilities targeted had not fully collapsed, meaning the setback to Iran's nuclear timeline might be measured in months rather than years. The Trump administration pushed back hard, characterizing the leak as politically motivated. The very next day, CIA Director John Ratcliffe offered a sharply different assessment, saying new intelligence indicated severe damage that would take Iran years to repair. Two of America's own intelligence arms, evaluating the same strikes, reached conclusions that pointed in opposite directions, a disagreement that has never been fully resolved in public, and one that matters enormously, because the entire justification for going to war rested on the claim that Iran's nuclear capability had to be eliminated by force. If the more conservative assessment is closer to the truth, then the war's central military objective may not have been achieved at all. For the United States, the decision to strike was framed publicly as the culmination of a military buildup that had been underway for months, described by regional analysts as the largest concentration of American forces in the Middle East since the 2003 invasion of Iraq. Washington maintained that its legal justification rested on the right to self-defense recognized under the United Nations Charter, pending any action by the Security Council, and accused Iran of continuing to advance its nuclear program even while indirect talks were ongoing, a claim Tehran denied. Whatever the legal framing, the practical effect was immediate and global. Within hours of the first strikes, the U.S. State Department urged American citizens to leave the region, and Trump later said in a social media post that more than 9,000 Americans had been evacuated safely in the operation's opening days. Global oil markets, already jittery from months of buildup, swung sharply as traders tried to price in the risk of a prolonged shutdown of the Strait of Hormuz, through which a substantial share of the world's seaborne oil trade normally passes. Iran's retaliation was immediate and expansive. Missile and drone strikes hit Israeli territory within hours. And for the first time, Iranian forces later struck near an Israeli nuclear site with long-range missiles, a significant escalation that alarmed non-proliferation experts on both sides of the conflict. Israeli airspace closed for days. Flights out of Ben Gurion Airport were suspended. The deadliest single strike on Israeli soil came on March 1st when a missile hit a residential neighborhood in Beit Shemesh, killing 9 civilians. But the war did not stay contained to Iran and Israel. Iran struck American military bases and Arab states hosting U.S. forces, including targets in Bahrain and Qatar, dragging Gulf nations that had spent years trying to stabilize relations with Tehran into a conflict they had not chosen. Britain deployed Royal Air Force assets in a defensive capacity after strikes hit UK bases in Bahrain, Qatar, and Cyprus. France reported its first soldier killed in the fighting. By the war's 5th week, according to figures reported by international outlets, more than 1,900 people had been killed inside Iran alone, and Iranian officials said the fighting had damaged more than 120 museums and historical sites, a toll on cultural heritage that added a quieter, longer-term kind of loss to the human one. After 40 days of sustained combat, a conditional ceasefire took hold on April 8, 2026, mediated by Pakistan. For a brief period, it appeared the war had entered a genuine diplomatic phase. In June, the United States and Iran announced a Memorandum of Understanding, a 60-day framework intended to structure renewed negotiations over Iran's nuclear program and broader regional security arrangements. It was the most formal diplomatic step either side had taken since the war began. But a memorandum is not a treaty, and a framework is not an agreement, and almost immediately, the underlying disputes that had caused the war in the first place resurfaced. Iran's core demand had not changed. It wanted the American blockade of its ports lifted as a precondition for fully reopening the Strait of Hormuz, one of the most critical oil choke points on the planet, through which roughly a fifth of the world's petroleum liquids pass. Washington's core demand had not changed either, guarantees that Iran would end its nuclear enrichment program altogether. By May, reports indicated Iran had proposed a compromise of sorts, offering to dilute a portion of its highly enriched uranium and transfer the remainder to a third country, with the condition that the material be returned if the United States ever withdrew from the resulting deal, echoing the kind of provisional trust but verify arrangement that collapsed once already in 2018. Iran also reportedly agreed to suspend enrichment, but for a period far shorter than the 20-year moratorium the United States was seeking. It refused, entirely, to dismantle its nuclear facilities. As a small gesture of confidence building, Iran allowed a Qatari liquefied natural gas tanker to cross the Strait of Hormuz in May, the first such passage since the war had begun, a symbolic opening that did little to calm broader anxiety in global energy markets, where prices had been swinging on every fragment of Iran-related news for months, which brings the story to now, to the first days of August 2026, and to the confusion that opened this account. Trump said that over the weekend he called off a new round of planned strikes on Iran after leaders from Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Qatar, along with Iran itself, appealed to him directly. He described what he called the parameters of a deal, first on reopening the Strait of Hormuz, and then, in what he termed a second phase, on what he referred to as the denuclearization of Iran. Oil prices fell on the news, and Trump publicly criticized American oil companies for what he said were excessive profits amid the price volatility the war had caused. He said talks between the United States and Iran would resume on Monday, August 3rd, and then Monday came, and Iran said no such talks were happening. Foreign Ministry spokesperson Esmail Bagay told reporters plainly that Iran had no negotiations underway with the United States and no plans to send a delegation abroad or receive one in Tehran in the days ahead. The only conversation Iran acknowledged having was with Oman, and it concerned a temporary safe passage through the Strait of Hormuz, not the nuclear question at all. Trump, visibly frustrated, took to social media and called Iran's leadership unbelievably duplicitous. He told reporters that the reopening of the strait was meant to be phase one, happening, in his words, literally by the next day, with the nuclear question to follow in phase two. Then came the line that has defined the week. This is a last chance for Iran to sign what he called a good document, and he said he wanted to give them every last chance before what he described as decapitation, a word choice that, whatever its intent, could hardly be read as anything other than a threat of renewed, targeted military escalation against Iran's leadership. Iran's response was not conciliatory. A senior Iranian defense official characterized Trump's decision to call off the strikes not as restraint, but as a calculated maneuver within what he described as a psychological operation and a broader war of calculations, adding that Iran would neither be caught by surprise nor remain passive if attacked again. It is worth being precise about what is confirmed here and what is not. It is confirmed that Trump said he called off planned strikes. It is confirmed that oil prices dropped in response to that statement. It is confirmed that Iran's own foreign ministry, on the record, denied that nuclear negotiations with the United States are currently taking place. What is not confirmed and may not be knowable from outside classified channels is whether back-channel discussions are quietly continuing despite the public denial, whether the claimed deal on Hormuz has any real substance behind it, or whether Trump's account of Gulf states pleading for de-escalation reflects private diplomacy that simply has not been independently verified by other sources. Diplomatic signals coming out of closed-door discussions between governments are notoriously difficult to confirm from the outside, and in a conflict already marked by dueling intelligence assessments and conflicting public statements, that uncertainty is not an oversight in the reporting. It is the honest state of the story as it stands. What is clear is the shape of the underlying dispute, which has not meaningfully moved since the war began 18 months earlier. The United States wants an end to Iranian uranium enrichment, full stop, something Tehran has never agreed to and gave no fresh indication of agreeing to in early August. Iran wants sanctions relief and an end to what it calls an American blockade of its ports, conditions Washington has not accepted either. Layered on top of that unresolved core is a deeper, unanswered question about whether the February 2026 strikes actually achieved their stated purpose. If the Defense Intelligence Agency's early low-confidence assessment proves closer to the truth than the CIA's more optimistic one, then Iran's nuclear program may not be nearly as crippled as the initial military campaign was intended to make it. That would mean the diplomatic leverage the United States believes it holds, built on the assumption that Iran's program was decimated, may be resting on an assessment that has never been fully reconciled within America's own intelligence community, let alone independently verified by international inspectors, who have had limited and contested access to Iranian nuclear sites since the war began. There's also the matter of what a phrase like decapitation actually signals about what could come next. In the context of a war that has already killed a sitting head of state, targeted senior officials directly, and drawn in Gulf states, European militaries, and global oil markets, that kind of language from a sitting American president is not abstract rhetoric. It describes, in blunt terms, exactly the kind of strike that opened this war in February. Whether it is a negotiating tactic designed to pressure Iran back to a table it says does not exist, or a genuine signal of imminent military action, is something only the coming days and weeks will reveal. And even experts who study the region closely disagree on how literally to read it, given how often deadlines and ultimatums in this specific conflict have shifted, been walked back, or been reinterpreted entirely by both sides. What this moment ultimately captures is not a single dramatic turning point, but the exhausting, high-stakes rhythm that has now defined U.S.-Iran relations for the better part of 2 years. A claimed breakthrough, a public denial, an ultimatum, a rejection, oil markets flinching at each statement, and a region that has already absorbed a war, a change in Iranian leadership, thousands of deaths, and the destruction of infrastructure and cultural heritage that will take generations to rebuild, all without the two core questions at the heart of the conflict: the fate of Iran's nuclear program and the terms of any lasting peace ever being definitively settled. Whether the words last chance mark the final act of open warfare or simply the latest chapter in a much longer standoff may not be something anyone can answer honestly right now. What can be said is this: in a conflict where a missile strike and a denied phone call have both, at different moments, been described by officials on either side as the truth, the most dangerous thing happening in the Middle East today may not be a weapon at all. It may be the fact that two nations capable of devastating each other can no longer agree on what exactly is actually being said between them.